Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
On the 14th day of October, 2005, a Friday, Vermont was hit with a thick autumn drizzle. It was on this day that a group of 4 senior scouts and 1 young assistant troop leader set out on a route along the famous Long Trail. Their goal was to cross Mount Glastonbury, a place that had long enjoyed a grim reputation among the locals for its rugged beauty and vast, dense spruce forests in which it was easy to lose one's bearings. According to the plan approved by the Troop Council, this was to be an endurance and orienteering test hike. The youngest member of the group was 16-year-old Jeff Lane. This hike was of special significance to him, as it was a crucial step before he could earn the prestigious Eagle rank. In a characterization later added to the investigation, Jeff was described as a quiet, studious boy who always followed the rules. He was slightly behind in physical fitness compared to his older comrades, 18-year-olds Brian and Mike, and their 22-year-old handler Simon Wells, but he made up for it with perseverance. Jeff was eager to prove himself worthy of his new title, and didn't complain about the heavy backpack, though the climb promised to be grueling. The logbook at the foot of the mountain contained an entry in the hand of Simon Wells. The group checked in at the start, at 8 hours and 30 minutes in the morning. The weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly that day. The Weather Service in Burlington had been issuing a storm warning since the evening that a cold front was approaching, bringing freezing rain and a sharp drop in temperature. However, the group, trusting in their leader's experience, decided not to cancel the outing. All day they climbed up the slope, overcoming rocky scree and slippery tree roots. At 17 hours and 45 minutes, as dusk was beginning to descend on the forest, the group reached Goddard's hideout. It was a massive wooden shelter built of thick logs, with a stone fire inside, located near the top of the mountain. This place was considered a safe haven from the wind, which at this altitude was piercing to the bone. According to Simon Wells' testimony, which he would later give to state police, the evening passed peacefully. The group built a fire and a rock fire to dry clothes and cook dinner. Simon claimed that Jeff Lane was in good spirits, although he complained of severe fatigue in his legs after the day's trek. The boys ate a canned dinner, discussed plans for the next day, and went to bed wrapped up in warm sleeping bags. Nothing portended trouble, except the wind, which howled in the gaps between the logs. The morning of October 15th greeted the mountain with an impenetrable milky fog. Visibility did not exceed 2 meters. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the silence on the emergency broadcast was broken by an alarm call. It was Simon Wells. The dispatcher on duty later noted in his report that the voice of the group leader was shaking with excitement. He spoke curtly and confused. Simon reported that 16-year-old Jeff Lane had disappeared. According to the version voiced by the group members, the events unfolded as follows. Jeff woke up before everyone else, at about 5 hours and 30 minutes in the morning. He allegedly took an empty flask and said he would go to a nearby spring to get water for his morning coffee. The spring was only a few hundred meters from the shelter, but with the thick fog that covered the summit, even the familiar trail became a maze. Simon assumed that the boy had taken a wrong turn, disoriented in the fog, and fallen off one of the many rocky ledges surrounding the camp. The search operation began as soon as 3 hours after the call. The scale of the response was unprecedented for the area. Hundreds of volunteers, professional rescuers, K-9 units, and National Guard helicopters began combing the slopes of Mount Glastonbury. However, nature was against them. The freezing rain that had begun the night before had turned the ground into a mess, washing away any traces. The cynologists had high hopes for the search dogs. They were given a sniff of Jeff's spare clothes, and the animals confidently picked up the trail at the entrance to Goddard's hideout. The dogs took a few steps in the direction of the woods, but then something happened that baffled even experienced rescuers. Literally 5 meters from the threshold of the shelter, the trail broke off. The dogs circled in place, whimpering but not going any further. It looked as if the guy just vanished into thin air or flew up into the sky. The rescuers checked every meter around the spring, examined every ravine and every slope where the teenager could theoretically have fallen, but they found absolutely nothing. No lost flask, no slip marks on the wet moss, no scrap of clothing caught on a branch. After 2 weeks of exhausting search, the operation was officially shut down. Police records showed Jeff Lane had been reported missing, and the probable cause of death was hypothermia from a wilderness accident. Mount Glastonbury had taken another victim, leaving only questions no one could answer. 5 long years had passed. Jeff Lane's name, once a fixture in local newspapers and on every Vermont newscast, has slowly faded from the community's memory. The only reminder of the tragedy were the old, sun-bleached postcards with the smiling teenager's picture still hanging in the window of Woodland Sapples, a camping equipment store in the neighboring town of Bennington. People passed by, no longer noticing the familiar face, and the forest on Mount Glastonbury continued to remain silent, hiding its dark secret under the canopy of centuries-old spruce trees. On August 24, 2010, the silence on the mountain was broken by the clatter of hammers and the creaking of old boards. A crew of volunteers from the Green Mountain Club had gone up to the Goddard Refuge for a routine overhaul. This massive wooden structure, which had stood up to years of wind and rain, was in need of major intervention. The lower crowns of the log cabin were beginning to rot, but the biggest problem was the wooden floor. It had become dangerous for tourists, rotten from constant dampness and temperature fluctuations. So the club management decided to replace it completely. The work was boiling from the very morning. Volunteers took out garbage, dismantled old benches, and tore down rotten boards, making room for new flooring. At 11 hours and 15 minutes in the morning, one of the workers was working in the far corner of the shelter, where the shade was thickest. As he was cutting into the old, time-darkened larch boards with a crowbar, he encountered an unexpected obstacle. The tool did not go into the soil, but hit something soft but resilient. The man shined his flashlight into the gap between the lagging boards and the rocky soil of the foundation. There, in a narrow, dark space where the sun had not looked for years, lay a massive, dense bundle. It didn't look like construction debris or the forgotten belongings of tourists. The object had an elongated shape and was pulled tight with nylon ties that cut into the fabric. Everything was carefully wrapped on top in a thick tarp, which, though covered with a layer of dust and cobwebs, still protected the contents from moisture and rodents. The workers called the foreman. Together, taking care not to damage the find, they pulled the heavy bag out into the daylight. When the top layer of tarpaulin was removed, it became clear that inside was a professional camping sleeping bag, an expensive item that hardly anyone would just throw away. The bag had been tied up so carefully, as if someone had tried to make it as compact as possible. One of the volunteers took out a knife and carefully cut the ties. The zipper on the sleeping bag was rusted and wouldn't budge, so the fabric had to be cut. What they saw inside made the grown men recoil in horror. Inside the cocoon were skeletonized human remains. Time and nature had done its work, but there were still remnants of clothing on the bones. It was a Boy Scout uniform that, despite the decay, was still recognizable by the distinctive patches and color of the fabric. Repair work was immediately halted. The team leader contacted the police via satellite phone. A few hours later, a Vermont State Police forensics team and homicide detectives arrived at the Goddard hideout. The place where thousands of hikers sought protection from the weather officially became a crime scene. The area was fenced off with yellow tape, and the entrance to the shelter was blocked off. The experts worked in silence and concentration. They carefully documented the position of the body, photographed every detail of the bundle, and examined the niche under the floor. Among the remains, personal items were found that left no doubt as to who exactly was lying in this makeshift sarcophagus. A preserved leather wallet containing documents and a specific dental chart, which was later compared to a missing persons database, confirmed the worst guesses. It was Jeff Lane. News of the find quickly spread among law enforcement, but the most terrible discovery awaited the detectives, not in the woods, but already in the morgue, while analyzing the situation. Jeff wasn't lost in the fog. He didn't fall off a cliff and freeze somewhere in the middle of nowhere, trying to find his way back to camp. All these 5 years, while volunteers were combing the woods, while parents were freaking out, and hikers were telling legends about the missing boy, he was here, literally under the feet of hundreds of people who slept overnight at the Goddard hideout, basking by the fire and laughing, unaware they were sleeping over a grave. Whoever hid him there did not act in a state of panic or affect. It was a cold, judicious act. The perpetrator knew the exact design of the hiding place. He knew that there was a blind spot under the floor in the far corner, a narrow space between the foundation beams that could not be accessed without special tools and the removal of the flooring. This was the perfect hiding place, which could only be chosen by someone who knew the structure of the shelter and realized that no one would go to check the rotten boards unless absolutely necessary. Friends, before we dive into the details of this complex investigation, I have an important request to make. Please subscribe to the channel, leave any comment below this video, and put a like. It's a simple action that takes a second for you, but for YouTube's algorithms, it's a critical signal. Your activity will help push this video into recommendations so that this confusing and enlightening story can be viewed by as many people as possible. Thank you for your concern and support. Chapter 3. Anatomy of a Fall. On September 2nd, 2010, Detective Mark Rollins received a document that changed the course of the investigation forever. It was a detailed report by forensic scientist Dr. Emily Grace. She had spent a week examining the remains found under the floor of the tourist shelter, and her findings left no room for ambiguity. The cause of death of 16-year-old Jeff Lane was no longer the mystery that had been written off for 5 years as an accident in the fog. Dr. Grace determined that death was the result of fractured cervical vertebrae and extensive trauma to the occipital bone. The expert detailed the mechanics of these injuries. The nature of the fractures on the skull and the angle of displacement of the vertebrae indicated that the boy had not fallen from a height into a precipice or rolled down a slope, as might have occurred when he went off the trail. The injury was the result of a sudden fall from a height of his own height. The victim's head struck a hard, sharp object with a distinct geometry with tremendous force. The report noted that it could not have been a random rock on a forest path hidden by moss. The geometry of the impact matched perfectly with an impact against the corner of a worked stone, probably the stone corner of a campfire inside Goddard Shelter, or the protruding stone of the foundation of the building itself. Death was instantaneous, or within minutes, due to damage to the brainstem. This discovery completely destroyed the previous version of events. This was not an accident somewhere in the middle of the woods. Jeff Lane had died inside, or in the immediate vicinity of where his companions were sleeping. Detective Mark Rollins, who led the reopened investigation, immediately lifted yellowed folders of interview transcripts from 2005 from the archives. He spent hours reading every word recorded 5 years ago. The story about Jeff waking up early in the morning and going to get water now looked not just suspicious, but completely illogical. It was cracking at the seams under the pressure of new forensic facts. Rollins realized that to hide the body the way it had been done was not a spontaneous act that could be accomplished in a minute. It took time, physical strength, and coordination to place the body under the floor. Heavy backpacks and gear had to be pushed aside, tools had to be found, and massive floorboards that were nailed down had to be lifted. Then it was necessary to lower the breathless body into a narrow alcove, lay it down, wrap it in a sleeping bag, tighten it with zip ties, and nail the boards back together in a way that would not arouse suspicion among future hikers. The detective conducted an investigative experiment in his imagination, matching this with the size of Goddard's hideout. The area of the hideout was small. To do it all alone, in complete silence, while the other 3 members of the group slept side by side at arm's length, was physically impossible. The creaking of old boards, the pounding, the heavy breathing, the rustling of tarps, any one of these sounds would inevitably wake the comrades in such a cramped space. This chain of logic led the detective to the only possible conclusion that cast a shadow over everything the police knew about that night. All 3 surviving campers, 18-year-olds Brian and Mike, and their leader, 22-year-old Simon Wells, knew the truth from the first minute. They didn't sleep while their friend disappeared. They didn't look for him in the morning because they knew where he lay. They lied to the police, lied to Jeff's parents, lied to the volunteers and the press. It wasn't just a lie born of fear. It was a synchronized, deliberate, and cold-blooded conspiracy that they had maintained for 5 years. 3 young men whom the community considered exemplary scouts carried a shared, dark secret. Rollins set aside the case folder and looked at the list of witnesses, which had now turned into a list of suspects. He realized that old friendships cemented by a shared crime were strong, but even the strongest chain has a weak link, and the detective had already guessed which of the trio might break first, if the right pain points were pressed. In October of 2010, while the forensic team was still finalizing the analysis of the evidence, the detectives shifted their attention from the gloomy slopes of Mount Glastonbury to the lighted streets of the city. The investigative team began methodically examining the lives of the 3 men who had emerged from the woods alive 5 years ago. During that time, while Jeff Lane's body slowly smoldered in the darkness beneath the floor of the tourist shelter, the lives of his former comrades blossomed into vivid colors. They didn't just survive, they thrived, becoming the epitome of what sociologists call the golden youth. Simon Wells, then 27 years old, had a dizzying career. The former scout troop leader was now a junior partner at a prestigious law firm in Burlington. His portfolio was impeccable: expensive suits, a confident look, participation in charity events. There was talk in town that Simon's ambitions extended well beyond the practice of law. He was seriously planning to run for city council in the next election. To the community, he was the ideal of a responsible citizen, a man who knew how to get things done. The other two participants in that fateful trek, Brian and Mike, both 23 years old, were also keeping up. Brian was graduating from a prestigious medical school, was in good standing with his professors, and was preparing to become a doctor to save lives. Mike followed in his family's footsteps and took an engineering position with his father's large construction company. They were the pride of the local community and role models. They shared a long-standing friendship, stretching back to their school days, and the one camping trip they preferred not to mention out loud. The police, after obtaining a court order based on the new circumstances of Jeff's death, put the trio under 24-hour surveillance. Their phones were tapped, and their movements were monitored by plainclothes operatives. The detectives were waiting for a mistake, any sign of weakness, and that moment came when a critical detail leaked to the media that the police were trying to keep secret. Journalists learned not just the fact that a body had been found, but exactly where it had been found. Newspaper headlines and television reports exploded with the sensation: body of missing scout found buried under the floor of the Goddard Shelter. This information was the catalyst that instantly shattered the calm of the suspects. The wiretaps recorded a dramatic change in the behavior of the golden youth. Between Simon, Brian, and Mike began a real panic. If before they communicated rarely and discreetly, now their phones were bursting with calls. According to the transcripts of their conversations, which would later be attached to the case, they spoke in hints, avoiding direct mention of names or events, but the tone of their voices betrayed an animal fear. They arranged urgent meetings in deserted places, nervously discussing news and trying to figure out what the police knew. Their perfect world, built on lies, was beginning to crack at the seams. Analyzing the suspect's behavior, the detectives noticed one important detail. If Simon Wells tried to maintain control and manage the situation even in moments of crisis, and Brian closed in on himself, then 23-year-old Mike began to rapidly lose ground under his feet. Strange, depressing posts appeared on his social media accounts, which he quickly deleted. Colleagues at the construction company said that the young engineer became absent-minded, suffered from anxiety attacks, and often snapped at his subordinates for no reason. But the most important marker for the investigation was the bar Rusty Anchor, a gloomy establishment on the outskirts of the city, which was rarely visited by decent people. The operatives reported that Mike had become a regular customer of the place. Every evening, after work, he drove not home, but to the smoky hall of the bar, where he sat alone for hours with a glass of strong alcohol. The establishment's bartender later told police that the guy looked like he was haunted. He flinched at loud noises, constantly checked his phone, and avoided talking about the past, especially when news of the Mount Glastonbury investigation was on TV in the bar. Detective Mark Rollins realized that Mike was the weak link they were looking for. His psyche couldn't handle the pressure of guilt and fear of exposure. Alcohol and anxiety made him vulnerable, and he could be the key that would unlock the door to the truth about the events of 5 years ago. Police decided not to wait for the suspects to agree on a common defense. Rollins ordered the preparations necessary to talk to Mike. The detective knew that this visit should not look like an arrest, but like a friendly conversation, which, however, could be fatal for the whole group. The detective's car drove toward the construction site where Mike was working, just as the young engineer was nervously smoking at the gate, unaware that his time was running out. The call to the police station came to Mike in the morning, as he tried to put his thoughts together after another sleepless night. Detective Mark Rollins had acted cautiously and strategically. He didn't send a patrol with sirens and handcuffs to the construction company's office, so as not to scare the suspect away early. Instead, it was a polite but persistent phone invitation, a simple request to stop by the station to clarify some minor details in light of new evidence. This soft entry tactic was intended to put Mike's guard down, to make him believe that he still had a chance to get away with it if he cooperated. Mike arrived at the station at 11 o'clock sharp. He tried to be confident, but the video cameras in the hallway captured his nervous movements. He kept adjusting his shirt collar and avoiding eye contact with the officers on duty. Rollins led him into the interrogation room, a small room with gray walls, a one-way mirror, and a metal table bolted to the floor. The air in here was stale and smelled of cheap coffee and old paper. The detective didn't read the rights right away, maintaining the illusion of a voluntary conversation, but the videotape of the interrogation was already running. The first 10 minutes of the conversation resembled a game of cat and mouse. Mike answered one-word answers, denying any involvement in the events of 5 years ago, and repeating a memorized legend about going for water. Rollins listened in silence, not interrupting. He waited for the tension in the room to become physically palpable. When Mike stopped talking, having exhausted his supply of prepared phrases, the detective slowly opened the folder in front of him. 3 photographs lay on the table. They were arranged in a neat sequence like tarot cards that foretold the inevitable collapse. The first photograph showed the floor of the Goddard Shelter being dismantled, the rotten boards lifted, revealing a dark void. The second photo was taken by a forensic scientist at close range. The decayed fabric of a scout uniform encasing human bones, and a shiny belt buckle that was preserved almost perfectly. The third photo was the most eloquent, a close-up of the stone corner of the fire inside the shelter, the same one that experts had concluded had been fatally struck. Mike froze. His gaze was fixed on the photographs. The color instantly drained from his face, and his hands began to tremble finely. Rollins leaned forward, closing the distance, and spoke in a quiet, almost confiding tone that was scarier than any scream. "We know this wasn't a murder in the usual sense of the word, Mike," the detective said, staring intently into the suspect's eyes. "Forensics told us everything. We know you didn't plan to kill him when you were out on the route that morning. It was a tragic accident, wasn't it? But what happened next? You hit him like garbage. You shoved your friend under the floor like old junk and left him there to rot. And that makes you an accessory to a felony." There was silence in the room, broken only by the hum of the ventilation system. Mike struggled with himself. His breathing became ragged. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He realized that his life as he knew it, career, reputation, freedom, had just ended. 40 minutes into the conversation, he broke down. He covered his face with his hands and began to sob, and the sound was full not so much of remorse as of the desperation of a driven beast. When the first wave of hysteria subsided, Mike asked for water and began to talk. His testimony painted a picture that was both banal and horrible in its simplicity. The story of the heroic trek and the tragic disappearance in the fog fell apart before his eyes, giving way to the sordid truth about that evening of October 14th, 2005. According to Mike's testimony, there was no scouting idol at the Goddard hideout that night. The atmosphere in the group was far from the charter rules of the organization. The boys had brought alcohol with them. It was cheap whiskey, which they had thoughtfully transferred into plastic soda bottles, so as not to jingle the glass on the way up and not to arouse suspicion from random encounters. Their leader played a key role in what was happening. 22-year-old Simon Wells, who was supposed to be a role model and a guarantor of safety, not only did not forbid the consumption of alcohol, but actively encouraged it. He himself poured alcohol into metal mugs, calling it a real man's recreation. Under the influence of whiskey and isolation from the outside world, a toxic hierarchy began to form in the group. A kind of hazing began, cruel and senseless. The object of ridicule was 16-year-old Jeff Lane. He was the youngest, the weakest physically, and worst of all, in the eyes of his older comrades, too right. Jeff refused to drink, reminding them of the rules of scouting and the dangers of camping, which only irritated his intoxicated friends more. Mike, swallowing tears, told how the jokes gradually turned into outright mockery. They called it a test of strength, or initiation. The older boys pushed Jeff around, took away his belongings, forced him to perform humiliating tasks. Simon, sitting by the fire, laughed and prodded the others, claiming it was the only way to build character. The situation in the cramped wooden shelter was heating up by the hour. Alcohol was washing away the boundaries of what was permissible, and the feeling of impunity in the wild woods was more intoxicating than whiskey. Jeff was trapped, An ice storm was raging outside the walls of the shelter, and those he considered his mentors and friends were waiting for him inside. According to Mike, the atmosphere had become so tense that the air seemed like it could be cut with a knife. None of them knew yet that this night would be the last for one of them, but the point of no return had already been passed, and events were inexorably rolling toward a fateful denouement. According to the detailed testimony Mike gave in the interrogation room, the situation in the Goddard Shelter had gotten out of control at about 22 o'clock in the evening. At that point, the psychological atmosphere inside the wooden log cabin was so tense that it resembled a bare electrical wire. The storm raging outside only added to the sense of isolation and impunity. The group was at altitude, cut off from civilization by a wall of freezing rain and impenetrable forest, and this sense of total absence of witnesses played a fatal role in the unfolding tragedy. The conflict reached its climax when 16-year-old Jeff Lane, who until then had silently endured taunts and physical abuse, decided to fight back. According to Mike, the boy, driven to despair by constant pressure, flatly refused to perform another humiliating task that the drunken group leader had devised for him. Jeff stood up and declared in a firm voice that he had had enough. He looked his tormentors in the eye and uttered a phrase that became the trigger for further events. He promised that as soon as he returned to town, he would file a formal complaint with the squad council and tell them all about the alcohol, hazing, and Simon's behavior. For 22-year-old Simon Wells, who had carefully built his image as a flawless leader and planned a political career, these words sounded not like a childish insult, but a real threat to his future. In his eyes, clouded by cheap whiskey, fear for his reputation instantly transformed into uncontrollable rage. Mike remembered that Simon's face changed in a second, becoming predatory and cruel. He couldn't let some teenager ruin everything he was striving to achieve. Simon rose abruptly from the bench by the fire and rushed toward Jeff, who was standing at the entrance to the shelter. The boy was in a high danger zone. Beneath his feet were the large, uneven stones that formed the threshold of the shelter. They were wet from the rain that had blown in, and covered with a slippery layer of mud from his boots. Jeff didn't have time to react to the sudden lunge. Simon shoved him violently in the chest with both hands. It wasn't a fight in the classic sense. It was a single, fatal movement. Jeff, who was wearing heavy, wet hiking boots, lost his balance on the slippery rocks. He staggered, flailed his arms helplessly, trying to catch air, and collapsed to the ground. In the cramped space of the shelter came a sound that Mike described in his testimony as a muffled, wet crunch. It was the sound of the back of his head hitting the sharp, protruding corner of the masonry foundation that held up the walls of the log cabin. It was as if time had stopped. Jeff fell and moved no more. His body lay in an unnatural pose at the entrance, half on the stones, half on the floorboards. Mike, sitting at the back of the shelter, later told detectives that in the first few seconds they expected the guy to get up, to start crying or screaming in pain, but he remained silent. His eyes were wide open and staring at the ceiling, but there was no life in them anymore. He jerked a couple of times, as if he had been electrocuted, and then fell silent, Mike whispered in the interrogation, wiping away tears. It was instantaneous. Sobering came with the horror. Simon, whose rage had died down as quickly as it had flared up, rushed to the lying body. He dropped to his knees and pressed his fingers to Jeff's neck, trying to find a pulse. Brian and Mike froze in anticipation, afraid to even breathe. The seconds dragged on like hours. Finally, Simon raised his head. His face was as pale as chalk. He slowly removed his hand and quietly said one word: everything. There was no pulse. A 16-year-old boy's life had been cut short by one ridiculous jolt and an unfortunate set of circumstances. Panic swept over the group in an icy wave. Brian started screaming hysterically, grabbing his head. Mike was throwing up from shock. They realized that they had just witnessed a murder. However, in this moment of chaos, Simon Wells displayed the character trait that would later allow him to have a successful career as a lawyer. He instantly mastered himself and took complete, firm control of the situation. He grabbed Brian by the shoulders and shook him violently, silencing him. Then he turned to Mike and stiffly, looking him straight in the eye, began to speak. His voice was firm and persuasive, unobjectionable. "Listen to me carefully," he mouthed each word. "Our lives are over if anyone finds out the truth. Do you understand? This is where the alcohol is. This is where we abused him. There's a dead body here. No one, you hear me? No one will believe it was an accident. The DA will tear us apart. They'll put us away for decades for gang murder. We'll rot in prison. Simon masterfully manipulated his friends' fear, turning them from witnesses to accomplices. He painted pictures of a shattered future, shame for the families, and the brutality of the prison system. He convinced them that the only way to save their own lives was to make sure that no one would ever know about that night. The boys, scared and confused, looked to their leader as their only hope. They didn't know yet what he would propose to do with their friend's body, but in their eyes, they were already agreeing to anything to avoid punishment. Then Simon's gaze fell on a gap between the floorboards in the corner of the shelter. In the moments when 16-year-old Jeff Lane's life had finally faded on the cold stones of the Goddard Shelter, the 3 surviving scouts had crossed an invisible line. They had gone from being just frightened teenagers who had witnessed the tragedy to an organized crime group. According to the interrogation protocols, it was Simon Wells, showing monstrous composure, who became the ideologist and architect of the plan to hide the body. He instantly assessed the situation. A storm was raging outside the walls of the shelter, visibility was zero, and the paths turned into icy streams. It was impossible to carry the body out in such weather. It would be fatal to them, and also greatly increase the risk of being spotted by random hikers if the weather suddenly changed. Simon knew the place better than anyone else. 2 years ago, he had participated in a volunteer program to maintain the tourist facilities on the Long Trail. He remembered the design features of the Goddard Shelter, particularly the fact that the wooden floor was not monolithic. In the far corner of the room, where the roof converged with the foundation, the boards were laid on lags in such a way that they could be easily replaced in case of rot. They were not intentionally nailed down. This knowledge became the foundation of their plan. Mike, in his testimony, detailed the process that took place in the dim light of the lanterns. They acted quickly, driven by fear and Simon's orders. Jeff's body was wrapped in his own professional sleeping bag. They used whatever they could find on hand, nylon tent ropes and leather pant straps to make it as compact as possible and easy to transport into the cramped alcove. They pulled their friend's body together as tightly as if they were packing ordinary gear, trying not to think about the fact that inside was the man with whom they had shared breakfast that morning. The next step was to open up the floor. In the repair kit kept in the emergency shelter, Simon found an old, rusty crowbar. Working in complete silence, they carefully hefted the boards in the corner. The nails creaked, but the sound was drowned out by the howling wind outside. When the planking was removed, a dark, damp void opened up before them between the oak planks and the rocky ground of the mountain. It was a perfect blind spot that no one but the builders knew existed. With a combined effort, they lowered the heavy bundle into the muddy alcove. The body lay in the narrow space, becoming part of the foundation, but the hardest part was getting the boards back into place without leaving any traces of tampering. Simon came up with a solution here too. In order not to use a hammer, the sound of which would have traveled through the forest, and not to leave fresh dents in the old wood, they used heavy stones. The boys wrapped the stones in thick woolen rags and towels, creating soft, deafening hammers. With these, they carefully hammered the boards back together, carefully hitting the old nail holes. With the floor restored and some debris and dust thrown on top for camouflage, the group moved on to destroying the evidence. Jeff's personal belongings that might give away his presence were carefully sorted through. Clothing, documents, and a synthetic fabric backpack they had partially burned in a stone fire. Mike remembered the acrid, sweet-smelling smoke that filled the shelter, and how Simon had moved the embers with a stick, making sure the fire had destroyed everything. But there were still things the fire couldn't destroy. The metal frame of the backpack, the buckles, carabiners, and massive boot soles. The plan to get rid of them was already realized on the morning of October 15th. About 5 o'clock, 30 minutes in the morning, while one of them remained in hiding to guard the legend, the other two, under cover of the fog, moved a mile deep into the woods, away from the trail. They scattered the metal parts in the thick bushes, simulating a chaotic search. It was then, in the pre-dawn gloom, that they finalized their version of events. It was a script they had to repeat word for word in front of the police, parents, and rescuers. "We agreed. He went to get water," Mike told the investigator, looking down at his desk. Simon made us memorize it like a prayer. He kept saying, "Stick to this story, stand your ground, and in a month, they'll forget it. The forest is big. People disappear here all the time. No one will find it under the floor unless we tell them ourselves. When, at 7 o'clock in the morning, Simon called the rescuers on the radio in a trembling voice, it was not panic of loss, but brilliant acting. They had played out the play of the search, knowing that every minute would put them further away from exposure. One thing they hadn't considered, however, even the most perfect plan has an expiration date, and small details, such as microparticles of nylon on the back of boards, can wait years to become a conviction. The police were already preparing arrest warrants because Mike's confession gave them a major bargaining chip against which any lawyer's strategy was powerless. The arrests took place the morning after Mike's fateful interrogation, when the first rays of the sun were just touching the peaks of the Green Mountains. The police operation was planned to the last detail to rule out escape or collusion by the suspects. Brian was apprehended on his way out of his apartment as he was about to go on duty at the hospital. He didn't resist, silently holding out his hands for the handcuffs, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for 5 years. The events around Simon Wells unfolded quite differently. He was arrested right in the office of a prestigious law firm in Burlington, in front of shocked colleagues and senior partners. Even as detectives read him his rights, Simon maintained a mask of arrogance and equanimity. He flatly refused to testify without a lawyer and said the whole thing was a terrible mistake that would cost the police department millions in lawsuits. Simon chose an aggressive line of defense. His family hired a team of the state's most expensive attorneys who built a strategy around discrediting the key witness. They argued that Mike was a mentally unstable alcoholic, whose testimony was the product of a sick imagination and police pressure. The defense insisted that there was no direct evidence of Simon's involvement in Jeff's death, trying to present everything as a slander of a jealous loser on a successful lawyer. However, Simon's self-confidence was shattered by the ironclad facts provided by forensic analysis. Forensics conducted a second, microscopic examination of Goddard's hideout. On the back of the floorboards, precisely in the niche where the body had been hidden, the experts found microparticles of blue nylon. Spectral analysis confirmed that this material was completely identical to the fabric of Jeff Lane's sleeping bag. In addition, deep scratches were found on the foundation stone, the geometry of which perfectly matched the metal belt buckle of the deceased. These silent witnesses irrefutably proved the body was buried exactly as Mike described, and Simon Wells was a direct participant in this process. The trial began 6 months later and became the most high-profile event in Vermont in the last decade. The courtroom was packed with reporters, relatives, and former scouts. The public was shocked, not so much by the fact of the teenager's death, but by the boundless cynicism of the defendants. People could not understand how 3 boys, who were considered the elite of youth, the pride of society, and the future of the nation, could live with such a burden. The prosecutor emphasized in his speech that for 5 years in a row, Simon, Brian, and Mike lived a full life. They went to university, fell in love, celebrated birthdays, and built careers, knowing full well that their friend, whom they called brother, was rotting in the dirt under the floor of a tourist shelter. They attended their annual scout meeting nights, looked Jeff's parents, Robert and Lindy, in the eye, and expressed sympathy as they continued to play their parts in this horrific spectacle. The court's verdict was harsh and final. 27-year-old Simon Wells was found guilty of manslaughter, concealing the body, obstruction of justice, and criminal conspiracy. The judge, reading out the sentence, noted that it was his leadership skills used for evil that caused the tragedy to become a crime. Simon received a 15-year sentence in a maximum security prison. His political career and law practice ended forever. Brian and Mike, through plea bargaining and sincere remorse, received significantly lesser sentences for covering up the crime. The court took into account the fact that they had acted under intense psychological pressure from their leader, but that did not absolve them of 5 years of silence. The finale of this grim story took place not in the courtroom, but where it all began, on Mount Glastonbury. A month after the verdict was announced, Jeff's parents, Robert and Linda Lane, ventured up to the Goddard Refuge. It was a difficult journey for the elderly, but they had to make it in order to say a final goodbye to their son. The shelter was not torn down despite its tragic history. It continued to stand on top, open to all winds. However, the atmosphere inside was forever changed. Tourists who knew Jeff's story instinctively avoided that very corner. That spot always remained empty, as if an invisible wall separated it from the rest of the room. Robert Lane pulled a small brass plaque and a hammer from his backpack. In complete silence, broken only by the rustling of the fir trees beyond the walls, he approached the bottom crown of timbers at the fatal corner. With a few sure blows, he nailed the metal to the wood. The plaque bore the simple inscription, "Jeff Lane. He didn't leave, he was here." Those words became an everlasting reminder to anyone who crossed the threshold of the Goddard Shelter. The story of the 4 scouts proved a frightening truth. The most dangerous monsters in the woods are not wild animals, ghosts, or mystical forces that scare children. The scariest monster is the common human fear for one's own future, which can turn off conscience and humanity, turning friends into architects of silence. The wind on Mount Glastonbury continues to howl between the logs, but now it carries not only the cold, but the memory of a boy who has finally come home.